Welcome, Vidhi and Morgan and Jesse and Kavya. All right, so we can start with any updates if people want to give them, and we can move on to the meetings for this week.
I need a little bit more time.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually heading into the lab.
Okay. Yeah.
Very briefly, it feels in my mind like May went by so fast. It's now Memorial Day weekend here in the United States. It's very interesting to talk to, colleagues around the world, not because it's some holiday thing, but just one of the people in the indigenous thought torches community is doing a very large travel all over and seeing their I just got some project updates from them about a prototype they've been developing. I'm talking to some clinical folks here in America and also here in not here in Australia, and just getting their take on a variety of things. It's been interesting. I just wrapped up the first, well, I guess it's really second batch of interviews for data and direction things as well. So there's a lot going on. It's going to be quite the summer. There's a lot of cool things happening with Echo. Like Ad is sort of taking a little turn into music related things, but also a lot of nice outlets for cognition as well. So there's apparently some things brewing here. There may be some events later this year for that, and very specifically, there will be there's an event. I think it's something like technology, like neurotechnology or neuroergonomics. At least neuroergonomics, which will be held here in Boston. It's actually in walking distance to where I am. Oh, you
yeah, it's a cool meeting. It's been going on for a while.
Can we tease you to come out to Boston for that? I don't think you can come back here for that, but I think it's in July, like the teens of July. So
yeah, I might be in China at that time.
Well,
yeah.
If anybody can be in
it's a cool
two sides of the world at once, I'm sure you can do it. But yes. That'll be cool. I don't know if I'll be able to go to that conference proper, but I know. Sorry about that. I know someone will be here specifically, and we're going to do a sort of a little GoPro event around it. Actually, it's Molly from Indigenous, and she's going to be here for that event, and there may be a smaller, like, adjacent event around it, or at least some kind of a discussion, either with GoPro proper or something joint that would suit sort of our cognition futures, chat bot, that whole space. I'm doing a very bad job of trying to describe it right now. But that reveal this weekend, also, I had a really nice, one of our former interns from Data and Direction basically gave a life update since things, and it was really nice to hear from them. So they might be doing some things to benefit the program ahead. And many of this current generation, I think some folks are going to be starting in June, which is, like I said at the start of this, man, it's just been so fast. Like I look at the emails from like April 30th, and
the first week of May, and it's like, oh yeah, that's yesterday. And it's, nope, it's, it's here. So a lot's going on. We push a lot of things live on the Joker website. I'm still continuing to flesh out at Google some like code history. There's a lot of old projects that we're trying to just save and document. So I guess I'll close by saying I mentioned some new things in terms of like YouTube channels and whatnot. But if anybody has a channel or a handle that they want mentioned, either in like these videos are mostly recorded. And if you want to be acknowledged or put on anything, just let us know, because I think we're getting better and better at that, and I'm trying to do more with that one too. So leave something in Slack. Started a thread there today, and that's, I'll leave it at that. I'm sure Bradley has things to say. I know Bradley's done some really good things about collecting some sustainability, open source sustainability stuff. So maybe we'll talk about that ahead. But more later, but that's a nice intro for now.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Yeah, we'll come back to that stuff later. We have, well, I've been looking at some of the things you've been putting in Slack, and of course, I've been doing some things with open source, getting that sorted out, and so we'll talk about that here in a minute. So, yeah, this week we had 2 meetings. We had the DevoWorm meeting, and then we had the open source meeting. So let's look at those 2 meetings now. So the first meeting was the DevoWorm meeting that was on Monday. We had started off with Mahul, myself, and Jesse, and I talked a little bit about some updates from OpenWorm, specifically that John White, who was one of the authors of the original C. elegans connectome, donated his Wiley Prize share to OpenWorm. So this is a prize from Wiley Prize in Biomedical Science, and he donated his share of it to OpenWorm. So I'm not sure what the amount is, but this is something where the OpenWorm Foundation has been dependent on a lot of small donations over the course of its history. So now we have the first big donation, and that should help us do things. There was a post on the OpenWorm Tumblr that talked about kind of the aims of this, kind of the aims of these donations and what they want to do with them and so forth. Okay, so yeah, we went through that. They really are focusing on building out the open source capacities of OpenWorm, so things like design documents, a contributor progression model, and AI-assisted contribution pipelines and things like that. So, if you're coming into the organization, how do you engage with the project? How do you know what needs to be done in the project? And then, through continual iterative design and other things, and then, using AI and AI assistance to update some of the old repos and make sure that things are consistent. I know that they've been doing a lot of work with sort of modernizing some of the old repos with AI, so that's been a push in the organization. There are other tools like the Connectome Toolbox that is like a data aggregation tool for C. elegans connectomes, so that can be also benefit from this donation. Okay, so then we had a discussion here about this. This was Mahul was here, and he talked about this hackathon event that he did with another person, a student, and it was where they were working with agentive agents, and they were working from a data set that we had talked about in a previous meeting, and then they basically had the agent build the code, run the code, and then they posted the paper on what they call Claw Archive, which is this site here. So it's like the archive, but it's for OpenClaw, basically. And so basically, an agent will, do some sort of coding project, post a write-up on Claw Archive, and then get peer review from other agents. It's kind of interesting how that ecosystem is kind of just self-contained, but in any case, the whole point of this exercise was to see how well agentive coding can do on a data science problem. So this is OpenEnv Hackathon India. That was where they were doing this. They were actually in the world modeling theme. And so they were working from this, it was like a dental data set where they had a three-dimensional model of different types of dental data, and they were trying to match images. I can't remember exactly what they were doing, but it was a failure. The experiment was a failure. They tried different things. It didn't work. But that the whole point of doing something like this at a hackathon is to seeing what can be done. Not so much if the experiments are a success or failure. It's that we want to see how the agent walks through the problem, and then we go into this whole peer review thing. So yeah, we talked about that for a while. It was pretty interesting, the outcomes of that. Morgan had some things to say about his fellowship and about what we were doing there. Then discussion continued. Then I talked about this paper on intelligent soft matter. This finished out the meeting. So this was a paper on soft matter and embodied intelligence. So the idea was that, a lot of times if we're doing like material science or some sort of engineering with matter, or sometimes even if we're dealing with questions in developmental biology, we will be dealing with soft matter. And there's this whole field of soft active materials where people are interested in engineering better materials through sort of thinking about the properties of soft matter. So soft matter are things that are compliant, things that can form different shapes, things that have memory. And the idea is to imbue these materials with embodied intelligence mechanisms. So we went through this paper. It's a vision paper. It's a perspectives paper. It was in, I can't remember what journal it was. It was a chemistry journal, I believe. And so the first author on this is Vladimir Balin. He works with the Active Inference Institute. So that tells you kind of where he's coming from. Martin Hanzik is also, a biologist. And so, that's kind of where some of these other authors are coming from. So it's a very interdisciplinary space. And, we went through the paper. They talked about sort of the vision for these soft materials and how they can benefit from embodied intelligence. There are things like distributed systems, emergent systems. There are a number of themes that have to do with emergent computation and thinking about information thermodynamics and things like that. So it's a very interesting paper. They want to basically imbue soft matter with decision-making, actuation, memory and learning, perception, and sensing abilities so that they're truly autonomous. So it was a very interesting paper. We had a short discussion afterwards about, the implications. Jesse brought up the whole point about embodied intelligence and, how that fits into the broader theme. So on Friday, we had our open source meeting. We've been doing this for a couple weeks now. And we had Barshan and Jess and myself to start. Barshan presented on his work. So he's the one person who was selected for GSOC, or who we got a slot for GSOC. And so he's working in the DevoWorm group on different aspects of graph neural networks and machine learning for development. Now, he wanted to talk a little bit about his community period activities, and then he wanted to talk a little bit about introducing attention into the DevoGraph platform. So we have, of course, in DevoWorm, we have 2 projects that have been ongoing for Google Summer of Code for like the last 6 or 7 years. One of which is EvoLearn, which is this platform for image processing and extracting features out of image data and building models of the embryo. And so DevoLearn has a lot of really interesting features. It hooks into pre-trained models. It hooks into segmentation models like SAM2 and things like that. So it's a very interesting platform. We moved away from that in the last couple of years to focus on graph neural networks. And I always encourage students to try to think about how that work will fit into DevoLearn, because DevoLearn is still there. And, it's one of those things where we don't have really very many contributors outside of GSOC. So it gets the treatment once a year, maybe. And then, it kind of goes to sleep and comes back. And we haven't made a release in a while, but it is fully functional hardware or software where it should be. I've not had anyone have real problems trying to run it if they're trying to work with it. So it's there in our DevoLearn organization. So if you go to github.com DevoLearn, then you'll be able to access both repositories, one for graph neural networks or developmental graph neural networks, and the other for DevoLearn itself. So Barshan is talking about introducing attention into DevoGraph, basically some attention mechanism into that model. And so this is mixing attention and graph neural networks. And so he was talking a little bit also about his community activities. He's been working in the DevoWorm meetings. He's been presenting on papers that kind of describe his vision for the future of, what he wanted to do for the project, but also his vision for the future of graph neural networks and development and things like that. So he actually prepared a blog post, which I will post to the Medium soon, but basically it's a recap of a number of papers he reviewed for his proposal. And so that's coming. But this slide is talking about some of the activities he did in the DevoWorm meetings. So he presented on a number of papers this last spring. He prepared a number of visualizations of the embryo and some of the cell tracking trajectories in the embryo. So this is some of that work. Then he, of course, has some goals for this year, this season. So our community bonding period officially ends sometime this coming week. So that's something that, I don't think we're going to stick hard and fast to, except for Barshan, who has to for the program, but he has to get going on the coding period. As for everyone else who wants to participate in open source development this summer, you're a lot more fluid as to what your schedule is and how you want to approach things. I know Vidhi just expressed interest in continuing and working on her Sustain Hub, which is something that we will start doing soon. So we'll be using these meetings, these open source meetings, to interact with people and get updates on what they're doing. So, all right. So that was Barshan, and then we had some discussions about what he was doing. We had some other discussions. And Jesse had, I think, talked a little bit about some of the things that he was, some of the professional development topics that he was interested in, especially like knowing what direction to go in when you're working on a big project. And so that was kind of interesting. We didn't have a lot of time to kind of unpack that, but I'm sure we'll come back to that. Now, Utkarsh Tyagi, he also applied to GSOC, and he had a very good application, but we didn't have a slot for him. But he's working on a couple things. So one thing he brought up to the meeting is this paper that we reviewed in this meeting several months ago, and that's this dragon hatchlings paper, or I guess the baby dragon hatchlings approach to large language models. And we talked about this as sort of as a replacement for transformers, using a brain-inspired model of information processing. So we talked about that paper a little bit. We went into the repo that they have available for that paper. So this is their GitHub repo where they have the code for these baby dragon hatchlings, and they kind of go through some of the graph theory of this. So they present this as an architecture that rivals transformers, but also is kind of a step back from models of what happens in the brain. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And then more recently, they've been working on the Sudoku benchmark. So their architecture actually can perform the Sudoku benchmark. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to do reasoning. So we talked about this in the meeting where we have these large language model outputs that are basically generative, and sometimes they don't make sense. They don't reason well on their own. What a lot of the big companies have been doing is developing these reasoning or chain of thought models where you can actually go through the output and kind of help the model reason. And so that's usually at the end of that pipeline. And so that's what they're trying to sell this approach as, a sort of a chain of reasoning mechanism, where it helps with chain of reasoning. And so the Sudoku benchmark is sort of the test of this. And they kind of they hedge a little bit on their result here, but basically that's what they've been doing with this code. So the code is here if people want to run it or play with it a little bit, and they kind of use this Sudoku benchmark as sort of the thing that you can try to achieve good results with. Okay, so that was, and then Utkarsh also worked on this with another collaborator from OpenWorm, Jean-Guillaume, who is in the OpenWorm Slack, and they were working on this project where they took, Utkarsh worked on this model called CindyG, which Cindy is a biophysical simulation platform, and CindyG is the graph version of that. So it's like putting a biophysical simulation into a graph. And then he was looking at that in contrast to C302, which is a model of the connectome. It's a biophysical model of the connectome where they model the biophysics of the cell, mainly the spiking activity and action potential activity of each neuron. And so you can model those things in C302. You can model some other biophysics in CindyG, and you can compare their performance. What what Utkarsh and Jean-Guillaume were doing here was they were looking at this Kenta benchmark, which is something that I think Jean-Guillaume was working on. So they were working on, kind of bridging all of this and bringing it together into a movement benchmark for using worm data. So basically, in C. elegans, what you can do, because the movements of the worms are so stereotyped, you can characterize forward and backward movements towards like a target, like some sort of bacterial stimulus, some chemical stimulus, or some other type of touch stimulus as as a movement forward or backward that's produced directly by a circuit. So we know what circuit produces forward and backward movements. We can knock out different neurons and see what the effect on that circuit is. We can also use a touch stimulus on the worm, on one side of the worm or another, the right side or the left side, and we can elicit different responses. And so that's what they were doing here. They built a model where they built the circuit, and then they had a movement that they could simulate, and they wanted to see how well that model performed. So that's what they did here. Okay, so that was an interesting foray into the world of OpenWorm, and that's all open source, and they're working on that repository, and it'd be interesting to see where that goes. Now, I wanted to bring up this because this is relevant to our group. So the open source sustainability project, what I've done in the last maybe week is to take things from that GSOC repository that we've been working from and I reorganized it into a new repository called Open Source Sustainability. I talked about the history of that original GSOC repo in the meeting. Basically, it was not originally built for open source sustainability, so it was very confusing as to where everything was. I could point you to like a directory, and that's, that would be, I mean, everyone was working on the large language models implementation of open source sustainability, Llama OSC, and that was kind of a self-contained directory. But in terms of finding the different parts, it was very hard to do. So I took everything, and what you can do in GitHub is you can clone a repository, and you can take the directories, and you can re-upload them to a new repository. So you have all of the old code, and you lose some of the metadata, but you gain this new organizational scheme. And so that's what I did here. I put a license on it with a README, and that kind of goes through sort of the contributor history of the project and everything else. So it's much more oriented directly to open source sustainability now. Things are sorted out by different different things. So we have the large language models approach. That's one directory. Then we have the reinforcement learning techniques, which is another directory. We have the different active and cybernetic approaches, which is in another directory. And then we have the sustainability auditing tool, which, as Jesse pointed out, not a lot of people even are aware that it exists because it was living in a forked repository. It was separate and apart from everything else. So everything now is in the same place. And I hope this maybe fosters some more kind of cross piece collaboration. What I mean by that is if you're working on large language models, do you know that these reinforcement learning resources exist? Or do you know that the sustainability auditing tool also already exists? So if you propose something very similar, you don't have to wonder if it's been done before because you can see that it's already here. And instead of kind of reinventing the wheel, you might just contribute to this. So I went through that. That was good. And I like this when we had a discussion about how a lot of projects will start off with maybe 2 or 3 people talking amongst themselves, kind of thinking about a problem, and then they're very casual in how they upload this stuff to GitHub. So you saw that repository with Qureshi, um, uh, the one that he was doing with the biophysical simulations. That's that repository probably will change, and then maybe the name of the project will change, and the way in which they're approaching the problem might change. So that means that you have this sort of legacy structure that you maybe isn't optimal for what you're doing in 5 years. So that's what I'm kind of getting at with this. And so in this case, it was particularly egregious because of the history of things. But I've kind of reorganized this now, and this is ready to go. I think we'll work from this repository from now on. So if we're working on something like Sustain Hub, we should work from this new repository. All right. And then, I have the list here in the README of all the different contributors over time. So this is something Jesse, of course, want to take note of. I've just been kind of brain dumping historical notes while I'm doing this. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that, okay, for the 2022 season, we had 3 contributors, and sustainability auditing tool was in 2022. And so there's this layering and, kind of bringing out, okay, who was doing what at what time. So that's another thing that was beneficial there. So then we had a discussion about, Jesse had this discussion about, he's talking about founders and how they kind of know how to guide a project, or they know what are the most important things to go to next. When you're, say, in a meeting, maybe you're in a demo or you're in a board meeting or something, you have to know kind of how to give feedback but you also have to know how to take feedback and make it actionable. And then you have to know the big picture, so how to fit that into your roadmap and to know what to do next. And then after that, so prioritization. Yeah, so he talked about that. And that was the meeting. All right, so that was our meetings for this week. Do we have any comments or questions on that?
So from the post, the OpenWorm post that they use Google Groups as their primary platform for communication.
Yeah.
So that was my question last week, or like at the, forget if it was DevoWorm or
Yeah.
but or maybe the open source meeting. But anyway, that answered one question.
Yeah. So I guess they used to use, Google Groups. Does that exist anymore? I'm not really sure, but this was originally what they were using, and then they moved to Slack, and then that's where we got our OpenWorm Slack.
It's on the Slack post from May 1st. The white metal announcement.
Oh yeah.
And they're on Blue Sky now.
Yeah.
And Google Groups is still the primary. I think they called it an email platform.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's another thing about managing open source projects is how do you get communicate with people? And it's I can tell you OpenWorm, they started with a certain stack where, you had ways to coordinate people, ways to post threads, things like that. But then, you have these platforms that kind of live for 5 or 6 years and then go away, or they become less popular. They're using Tumblr, which is not who's using Tumblr now versus 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, well,
That's
I
a
mean,
blast.
yeah.
From the past.
But my point being is that they have had a lot of things come and go, and you have to migrate everyone, and that's a problem sometimes if you're going back far enough for communications. It's if I had this discussion, was it in Slack or was it in Google Groups or was it somewhere else?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a massive problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of like an archaeology of open source projects. If you go back far enough, you have to have the what they call the provenance, which is the location of things and the sort of the context and trying to preserve all of that. Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, data provenance too. I mean, that was kind of the idea, is that it gives you that context of where something is from and not just here's something we were talking about 10 years ago. All right. So I guess I don't know if we can move on to Jesse, because I wanted to talk about some things he's been up to. Well, maybe I'll start and then he can join in later.
Yeah, you can say things, and I'll probably, I don't know, but I'll talk about the really shortly. And if you want to get started.
Okay.
I also wanted to mention that, I don't know if we were going to talk about it, but I wanted to mention that the Alpha seminar series happened.
Okay.
So I might say more of that at the very end of the meeting or much later. But more importantly, I did talk to Amanda Nelson. It was really good to talk with her. She's still in France, but she's interested in doing something. I don't know if she's going to be able to make it to this meeting, but she's kind of interested in some competition futures. Kind of basically what we were starting on when we left off a year or two ago.
Right.
So that's exciting. More about that later too.
So this is something that I think it was from the Slack. I'm not sure, but basically this was something that Jesse posted, and I don't know exactly what the provenance was of this, but like this is where he's talking about nascent science versus public science, and this is, I think it may have been associated with one of the reading groups that you're involved in, but Holton made a sharp distinction between two phases of the scientific enterprise. So S1 is science in the making, or nascent science. And this is what we call the private stage. So this is science or modes of investigation that are messy, subjective, and filled with intuition, aesthetic preferences, and thematic commitments. This is where the z-axis is most active. I guess you mean like there's a three-dimensional space where z-axis is progress, basically, and progress is made in the z-axis. And then S2 is finished science or public science. So this is the public stage as opposed to the private stage. And so once a discovery is made, the z-axis is sanitized away. The resulting paper is written to look like a purely logical deduction from empirical facts, which is the x and y axes. So this is, of course, what a lot of times happens with papers. If you write up a paper, a lot of times people will, especially like a nature paper, a lot of times it'll be presented as if, well, this was something that was pretty elegant in its sort of origin and then execution. So, you say, well, we had this idea, and then we had this hypothesis, and then we tested the hypothesis, and we got this result, and we did a great job. And what you don't see is a lot of the sort of false starts and, kind of irregularities that went into that result. So sometimes, you'll have, if you run an experiment, you might have research assistants collecting data, or you might have people processing the data. And they maybe try different things before they get to the thing that's actually in the paper. So this is a thing that I think a lot of people have talked about in terms of reproducibility. That is, if we aren't transparent about this sort of private stage or S1, then we can't really have a good account of S2. I mean, we can publish the paper and sometimes it's reproducible. I mean, it looks great and it looks very elegant and it boils everything down to exactly what you basically need to know about that project. But you also miss a lot of the detail that may be critical to replicating a result. So if you tried things until it just worked, which is sometimes a lot of times what groups will do. They'll just kind of say, well, we tried things, and then if something worked, we stuck with it. And sometimes that's a mix of intuition and trial and error, and which is great in retrospect because you can say, oh yeah, that obviously worked. But in the moment, it isn't necessarily a smooth path. And so this is so you can think of this 3D space where you have kind of things building up along a z-axis, or like going up in time. And then you have a lot of false starts, you have a lot of things that you try, you have a lot of alternatives and decisions you have to make. And then you get to this place at maybe the public stage, which is the top of the graph, which is where you have your x and y axes. And on those axes, you can draw out your results. And then that's what you show to the public, as opposed to everything underneath on the z-axis. So that was interesting. And then the graduate insight. So Holton's legacy is a warning to historians and scientists alike. If you only read the final papers or this S2 phase, you're missing the actual engine of discovery, or the S1 phase. And that, I think, is really insightful because you have this you have all of the the innovation underneath this final result. And you can't understand that final result, really understand it, unless you revisit the sort of the S1 phase. Now, when people talk about innovation, they're often like they talk about it like kind of as it's a magic phrase. Like, we want to foster innovation. Okay, how do you foster innovation? Do you have people publish a bunch of highly polished papers, or do you give them a space and let them do things for a while, and then when they get ready to produce some polished report, then let them do that, and then that's your result. But of course, the innovation relies on that sort of first part where people are doing the work, and there's no polished paper to mark progress, only kind of updates and things that look quite messy. So and then sometimes people expect the polished result right away, which is a problem for fostering innovation, because you simply can't have innovations, or you can't have leaps of discovery without that messy part in place. And sometimes it takes quite a while.
Yeah, a lot to say about all that. I think, especially, there's a few different hats and lenses by which, I don't know if I can for this or not, it doesn't matter.
There you go.
A few different hats and lenses by which we can take all of that. One is sort of what the person who is being cited here is, I believe, Gerald Holton, and he was someone I'm still getting into in terms of understanding their whole deal. I have the book on my desk that I found, this old used book of the things like the thematic origins of scientific thought. And he has his whole lineage of work, which is incredibly frontier map related, philosophy, history of science related. But a lot of his work is, that was one of his earlier works, I think. And he's got a whole lineage of works that's looking at different angles, especially things like, I think he really goes into how, like Einstein's era and the sort of early 20th century landscape of like physics development, like what that was like and how it was. Like, yes, it was science, but it was also what were the conditions that enabled a lot of things. So that this work, the screenshot you're seeing is a discussion. It might have been with Gemini or something. I was having a discussion with it about that work, the original work, or the earlier work I mentioned about the thematic origins of scientific thought or scientific something, science, I don't know. And it was sort of in relation to some broader projects in philosophy, history of science. I'm launching the Jupiter Future Center soon, which is kind of going to be partly about, diagnosing, surfacing, identifying certain trend lines, past taken, past not taken, and what have happened, particularly the last few hundred years of development, and why things became where they are now. But the other side is like, yeah, like that's like the history and the cool side of things, but the sort of pragmatic or directly, the things that can directly tie to us here today are, one, like cultivating the means to do like the messy, unstructured, maybe undocumented work that isn't quite as it's not the final polished thing, but then also like, and that's important for us. Like, how do you get people to be able to do that? How do you can you offer people the space to explore that or not? And like that's a lot of the things that we offer people that you can't do in certain spaces is the exploration of that. Let me get in the store and say a little bit more.
Okay.
And there we go. So specifically, I also like as another, like, this is maybe a direct a direct part of I don't know. As like a slightly contextualized version of what I'm talking about, I'm so thankful to have been a part of the brain-inspired complexity groups discussion series, going through the complexity papers, because I think those discussions are like the gold mine of this context, especially talk about nascent development and whatnot. A lot of those, David Krakauer selected or edited or put together the volume for those things to try to trace out a lot of what we're talking about here. Even particularly something like the Turing test, the paper about the Turing test, and what that really means in terms of Turing's overall thought. Like that was at a particular point in Turing's career that was originally contextualized in a very particular way. Some people aren't sure if the Turing test was like almost a joke or a dinner party thing that turned into a paper. Like, and there's huge implications for what it meant. I think there's also profound implications for, like, but a large part of the Turing test is this idea of passing. Like, if you don't understand Turing's personal background and his identity and other things going on, and you don't know anybody who's dealing with the idea of passing for this or that, then like I think there's a huge a lot of people talk about this landmark paper and have no idea that like that's like quite kind of a huge part of it. And it's not does that affect the technical merits of what it says or not? No, but it's like you're missing all these like very particular parts that become these things that are, you know, so to kind of extend it, take this from a slightly different angle, like if you don't understand, or if you're not, and I would say by and large, everybody isn't, unless you have a particular interest in philosophy and history of science, or you're trained specifically in it. But like if you don't know how to have this lens of investigating this nascent stuff or the development, and I think we're in a particular era where many things that have been like I don't want to say hyper refined, but very refined for very specific means and very specific, if you will, bubbles is maybe a strong word. The very specific conditions in which certain fields of development have emerged, and understanding sort of the wave between the nascent developments, and I think with a lot of people, like a lot of us and other people, and like even like Levin, why is Levin constantly citing the 1943 paper about behavior, purpose, and teleology? Like, because a lot of those like formative papers at the time, they don't have gigantic data sets. They're these sort of position papers. They're trying to demarcate these spaces in the field, and like we see, okay, if you look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. There's certain trajectories things go, and that's a wonderful thing. That's a natural thing. It's when you're proceeding forward in time, you're going to go down a particular path. But I think a lot of like even Levin's kind of going back to that isn't just, hey, it's a nice thing to cite. It's like also realizing, okay, like one of the things that's come up in some of the cognition futures adjacent discussion, or even a little bit with Amanda this week, is like looking at cognitive science is a kind of implementation of the original 1960s hexagonal cognitive science effort of using computation to be modeling X, Y, and Z, and integrating philosophy and artificial intelligence and anthropology, you know, and our classic refrain in the lab, at least, of like what happened to cognitive science in the Nunez paper. Like you see this sort of development, and it's like, I hear myself saying almost a little bit like David Krakauer, which is like, oh, cool for me, but also like sometimes David just talks like, oh, lineage, name, thing happened. It's like, whoa. But like getting a context for all of that, I think matters quite a bit. Anyway, to kind of zoom back out or wherever we are to this directly, yeah, I feel like from the point of trying to empower people to delve through the nascent stuff, like is supporting them, and then also kind of giving them enough information to say, okay, like sometimes there's typically situations where like either you're doing this because you want to, and you're not getting paid to do it, or you have a particular deadline or particular funding commitment. And some of those dictates the time, like what your budget, whether it's money or interest or like time to spend on something or not, and helping people acclimate to the different pressures and what you can do in them, I think is sort of part of the work of that. And I think we're in a new age of transparency, or like potential transparency around, you know, as much as we have the AI generated slop, we might talk about the archive 1 year ban stuff later. We're in this stage of like the ability to go from a kind of an idea to a working paper to an idea to something you can do some kind of a simple testing or simulated, you know, data or whatever. That's very different now. And particularly looking backwards, there's a lot of stuff in the last century that can be re-examined from, you know, newer viewpoints. So I don't know how, you know, there's a lot here that ties to both what we're trying to do now and support people in doing, and also hopefully develop some of the literacies to understand those things. And yes, I have the book now. It was Gerald, Holton, Thematic Origins of Scientific Thought, Kepler to Einstein. So he's looking at that particular era of like how those landmark figures were operating, not just pulling brilliant ideas, but also reacting to sort of the norms and current challenges of their time. He says his concept of themata, induced from case studies with special attention to Einstein works, has become one of the chief tools for understanding scientific progress. So yeah, I said a whole bunch. I will let you all reply.
Yeah, that's good. So this is like a philosophy of science take on all of this, you know, just kind of formalizing this idea of, or like the way that they formalized it as sort of this sort of axiomatic method here. So yeah, yeah, I think that's great. And a lot of things having to do with like CogSci, and I was reading a post this week or a couple days ago on the Cultural Evolution conference that just happened in Morocco. So it was Cultural Evolution Society. And they were talking about how, like, that area of research, cultural evolution, is actually a highly interdisciplinary area. You know, it brings people together from a lot of different fields, a lot of people with a lot of different sort of perspectives on things, but also with a set of assumptions that they bring to that. And then the idea is, you know, how do you keep that community together without, you know, and still have it be functional as a community? Because a lot of times you bring people together from different areas and they kind of tend to just agglomerate in their own little groups. And there's no real benefit of having that larger community. So that's always a problem that we have to kind of address. And of course, in philosophy of science, they've addressed in different ways. I mean, you know, and so that's kind of an interesting place to really kind of dive into for a lot of insight there. You mentioned the 1 year ban on arXiv. So this is an interesting thing that I don't have the article in front of me, but basically the arXiv announced that if you submit a paper with hallucinated references, that you get a 1 year ban from the platform. And so it's meant to sort of curtail a lot of the papers that are either written by agents or people use agents irresponsibly and just kind of, you know, don't check their work basically before they turn the paper in. But of course, there are going to be a lot of false positives that are swept up in this, where people don't get the reference right, or, you know, maybe it forces people to check their references more thoroughly, But at the same time, there are things that we're attributing to large language models and hallucination that are actually other things. They could be human error. They could just be like, you don't know what the reference is. Maybe it's an old historical reference that is, and I've had this problem where it's just wrong because it was kind of passed down as being wrong, and it's hard to find the original source. So that's an interesting take. I have a thing in my project management class that I talk about where I talk about very new technologies that arise, and then they become very popular, and then no one knows how to deal with them policy wise. So if you're like, and this has happened with Gen AI, right? You've got this technology people start using, and it becomes disruptive to an area of inquiry or many areas of inquiry. And institutions have to respond by kind of putting governance rules in place about how to use them. So like a lot of organizations have tried to quickly develop rules around generative AI. And some of them have been like maybe reactive, and most of them have been inadequate because we simply don't know kind of how to deal with these technologies. And the same thing happened with like the internet or with Wikipedia, and you can go back and see examples of this where you have these new technologies arise, they become disruptive to a certain way of doing things, and then you have to kind of develop rules around that. But then the rules are never going to really be very good until they're kind of tested. And that probably holds true for a lot of governance structures, like like governments making laws about new technologies. Same kind of thing.
I think one of the things that's resonated a lot with many of the data and direction folks and people and some of the spaces is like, this is almost I'm not a therapist, but this is something that comes up in my role as an advisor or mentor or whatever kind of whatever role that might be, is a lot of people are quite, when people grasp that, especially right now, especially the last 6 years or so, I will always remember like seeing videos of like Sam Altman just being like, yeah, people are just going to get used to there being a lot of fake videos. People are just like of themselves and of everybody else, and we have people just making unilateral decisions about what norms will be, and I'm not really here to badmouth any particular group of people, but just this state to Bradley's point is true in general. Like, and it was true 10, 20, 30 years ago to some extent, right? Like that's the way technology has been. But now we're in this state where, and this is why I'm personally using language that's kind of maybe outlandish, but I think there's something, I think the Overton window is shifting towards where I am standing, which is, I think it is correct to say we're generationally underprepared for many of the things that are happening now. Like, I think this came up in one of our discussions last week or so, or commonly here, but it's not just that we're living in a world where there isn't testing. Like the product, like if it was the FDA product, you'd have to have 10 years for it to be cleared to release in the manner that it is. At FDA's, not FDA, maybe FDA, the clinical trials ones, the things you have to go to Europe for and whatnot, like to get your clinical medical technology, right? And it's like that's an incredibly slow process, right? We're like the opposite version of that, where I think it almost an unfortunately correct way to say what's going on is people like the AHA group that are desperately is a harsh, maybe unfair word. They're trying to rush to make a benchmarks for human flourishing and building in 2026, these collaborative efforts to get benchmarks for human flourishing so we can measure some of the quality of these interactions that are coming out to these large things. And kudos to like the foundational model stuff and all the stuff that was happening before, but like we're testing the impact 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the release. like people need it's so my therapeutic comment for people who who are trying to figure out what is going on, or like I'm a young person, I care, what do I do? It's like realizing, hey, you've been thrust into a timeline here where the testing is happening after the fact now. And I'm not normalizing it. I'm not giving it a normative good or bad. It's like, this is where we are. Like whereas, I love the Future Shock book and the Present Shock book. And I mention those all the time, but like, this is contextually where we are and trying to sort that out. On a similar adjacent note to what Bradley just said about the arXiv paper, not only that, I just saw this the other day, but not only is arXiv coming back, there's the growing backlash on many fronts. Like this is about Berkeley School of Law imposed a blanket ban on using AI for any purpose, for any work submitted for credit in any exam situation, effective now. So like major organizations that are technically literate, let's call the school Berkeley technically literate, are having these reactions about things. And it's like, that's just where we are in the process of trying to deal with this in a technical, cultural, political sense of it, And so, because there was I'm gonna somewhat mockingly reference Holton here, and I don't mean to trivialize it this, but just that we're gonna get used to the video being everywhere. When that's the release pattern, we're gonna have a lot of this overcorrection. We're gonna ban everything, and we're gonna this, and it's like, it's really challenging. My final therapeutic comment for women is like, it's incredibly challenging to figure out, well, what the heck do I do? Like, where do I incrementally try to build something as all these things are ping-ponging back and forth? And there's policy changes, and so just sympathy for that. And the process of even going back to the nascent science stuff of like, how do you try to incrementally build things that can be or should be built in the context of all this? It is a challenging time, but there are ways to do it. So that's my positive therapeutic message for the day.
I like this last statement. We don't think that adding water to instant microwave-ready pasta carbonara amounts to cooking, do we? Some students might think it does, but we know it doesn't. I mean, obviously, they haven't been to some of the finer restaurants in the rural Midwest, but, it's, I guess, it depends on your perspective. Like, if you think it's acceptable socially to do something versus not. If it's, that's something that you're, that's like, younger generations will embrace technologies in different ways than like maybe the administration. And the administration, or the faculty, we didn't do it that way. And, we don't really see that as being legitimate or part of the legitimate mode of inquiry. And, younger people probably not have a problem with it. It might be just kind of part of their workflow. I mean, you could say the same thing about calculators back when digital calculators were a thing. People would they would used to ban calculators from exams because they were, considered cheating. But now, of course, you can use a calculator and encourage people to use them because it like kind of debugs a lot of the problems that you have in the exam. So yeah, I mean, it's always about norms too.
My personal take on this is sort of adjacent from the Princeton Envision Education panel. I think we're in a moment. I think to have a lot of like my macro work with people seems to be avoiding the ping ponging and whatever, and trying to identify like actual meaningful things, so like substantial things to work on in the spaces. You have to be relevant, but what do you do? And this is one of them, is like in the education space. My general opinion and advice is like, one, seeing this little evolution of, oh, we don't want to use. That's why it's kind of interesting to see Berkeley be like, oh, we're not going to do that at all now.
Yeah.
It's like, how are you going to uphold that legitimately in some ways? Like are you going to sign an honor code about that? Which is a separate discussion, and I don't mean to trivialize that at all. But seeing this level, like one of the things in the panel was like, oh, a while ago, nope, like it was super, you didn't talk about GTP. We like, no, we're not, no. And now it's just like, yeah, whatever. And now like even in some of my people that I'm working with or interns or whatnot, it is a different, I personally don't approach it like it's a bad thing, but I feel like I'm very clear. Like I'm very disinterested in trying to evaluate the generation of the thing in some cases, but I'm very interested in, what are you thinking about this? Like, tell me what you're thinking and what you're seeing, how is it used and what is it doing? Like, you tell me that. I don't want to read it. I don't want to see you reading from script. You tell me where we're going with that. So that's one part of it. But then also more broadly, like, I think in terms of what to focus on, I think education in particular, and not just the major Canvas Canvas, the big Canvas platform issue. I think education in particular is under this incredible. I think that the term painted into a corner, and what I mean by that is, a lot of optimizations have had to happen in education in big institutional spaces, for money, for compliance, for doing things in certain ways, and obviously there's political stuff happening now. Even before recent things, I mean, COVID was a major hit. A lot of universities closed after COVID, but a lot of things that were sort of like optimized, if you will. I'm gonna pull the Richard Sutton bitter lesson again. But a lot of things have been optimized for, oh, this really works in this really specific context. And I think that context space has just been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, in part because of social changes and in part because of technology as well. So now you're in the danger zone that Sutton kind of points out as a bitter lesson of like, guess what? Like, all the things you optimize for here are not really tenable. And so that's why I've continued to be impressed and excited. One, like, kudos to Bradley for making orthogonal lab a long time ago in a way that kind of could navigate the space. But also, like, many of the new focused research organizations, somewhat, these new ways of trying to doing funding and research, and like kind of, that's why residencies are so popular, even though I kind of, I poke fun at them a little bit sometimes, because it feels like when you don't know what to do, oh, I'm going to go do a residency in this space and hang out with cool creators, developers. But at the same time, it's like, where else are you going to go?
Right.
Because a lot of conventional institutions are so strapped about what they can do and teach and offer you. So yeah, you're going to be looking for alternatives. And there's, I mean, look at NeuroMatch. Like, the story of NeuroMatch is fascinating this way. It's a conference that came up in the COVID era, and now it's an academy. Now it's running amazing things. Now I might be another professional development mentor for the NeuroMatch Academy projects that, again, I think it's an awesome program with awesome people that are really trying to both deal with the present realities and create things in the absence of, dealing with that painted into the corner problem and offering new things. And then obviously there's Morgan and Pierce, and can talk about like neurotech and Frontier Tower and the cool things that Morgan's doing too. Yeah. So, but I think there's a lot of cool things there. It's just, and there's a huge gap between people that don't kind of know, for lack of better terms, if you go through university and graduate school, you may not be exposed to any of what I'm talking about. And you may think that that's, oh crap, I got my degree and I got my 4.0. And you may not be aware that like there's this whole other stuff that's trying to deal with the problems that we're talking about. And I think that's where a lot of, I'm very, an issue near and dear to my heart, because I've been on both sides of it, particularly the bad side of it for a long time, is getting people to the table, or even knowing there's potentially seats at a table to do interesting things. And I think a lot of people are looking, and I think there's a lot more opportunities now, like even people just searching for my old internship postings last year. I didn't announce anything. They found the old ones and asked out this year. It's like, oh, I want to try to do this. There's a demand for it. So it's just, can you make things that people want to do now that are savvy about what's going on and still give them meaningful credentials and things to build out and so on. That seems to be where the action really is. And then trying to let people know that are stuck in some of the old ways, like, hey, you can do this too. So that's a huge set of tangents, but many of them are important.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to have that discussion about like AI agents and EdTech, right, in open source meetings. So maybe we're having it here. I think you raise a lot of interesting questions about like education and in particular EdTech and the role of EdTech in shaping kind of how things get taught and delivered to people. So, if you had like a very small classroom, you had like a group like this, you can customize, you can tailor curricula. And that's maybe kind of, one way you can get around, maybe, because people learn different ways. People have different sort of speeds of acquiring information. And that's a good thing, if you can tailor that learning experience. So one group of people could maybe gain, absorb things very quickly and get things through maybe technical demos. And another group of people might want to like slow read through references and maybe kind of develop their own things. And both of those things are valid, but you can't do them typically unless you're like in a very customized environment. You have a very small environment. And what happens with a lot of larger courses, because you have to have in universities, it's oftentimes you have to have a certain class size. Sometimes it's very large classes for introductory courses. We just simply don't have the resources to keep delivering the same content to 8 people and giving them time to do things like that. So it gets delivered in a very different way. And of course, you need to have technologies to help you do that, or else it's too time consuming. And so that's where we get our content management systems, one of which is Canvas. And it's great when it works, but when it doesn't work, especially during finals week, that's a problem. And this happened like across the United States, but specifically at the institution that I was at, because our institution is they're very sophisticated, but also militant about cybersecurity. And it wasn't their fault; it was the fault of the company, or it involved the company that delivers the service. So the university, they basically had a conniption fit about like this whole thing, and they wanted to, you had people with opinions basically in IT and in in the tech sphere, and so that was the problem. And they wanted to make sure that people were secure when they go log on to the content system, that they could access everything they needed to access. So, you get a lot of these kind of situations where, because of the scale that you're delivering things at, because of the sort of the way in which you'd like to teach things, or the way you can teach things given your resources, you have to use certain technologies. They're not always optimal. Sometimes you're reliant on things that are brittle. So like, ideally we'd like to kind of craft our own systems of distribution. We'd like to have redundant networks of things. So if one thing goes down, like when I do the meetings here, I have a tech stack that I rely on. And I kind of have redundancies built in, but I can't really do that because it's like I would have to update things in 3 different places constantly. And I can't do that because it's just too much work. So, we have a brittle tech stack in some ways, but it also works pretty well for what we're doing. So, I'm reliant on some of these technologies, and if they go down, then we don't have a meeting. Or if we have a problem in any part of it, then I have to kind of improvise and do things differently. So yeah, I think there's a lot of like, and a lot of these technologies are fairly new. Remember that video conferencing is like not that old. I mean, good video conferencing is not that old. And
Yes.
it's like people have to learn those technologies, and you sometimes have to move to better platforms, or you start with a platform that isn't optimal and you can move to better platforms, and that shift costs you something, and it's not related to the actual content, which is frustrating.
Yeah, and like I was when you first started talking about the other things, I thought of like in my mind, in my ultimate like Joe Pro dreams, I think about Joe Pro being something like some kind of a modern, um, university campus like entity that offers a lot of different types of things.
Yeah.
Um, which we'll see about that. And right now we're a humble collective of projects and programs, let's say, which is just fine. But in that most same motif, I was thinking of like, oh, so the first when you first started talking about the different room in the small course, like, the return to the 21st century's return to the one room schoolhouse where you have the actual different, and this is kind of what data and direction honestly is becoming, because like we've had a couple like with PhD students, and we have these undergraduates or like underclassmen, and it's a bit like and in my ideal sense, I love to offer them a virtual one room schoolhouse where we're all talking about these topics, but you have like being able to mediate that, being able to mediate that asynchronously, like that's where actually I do think there's a gigantic, if you can get the right people in the right room and handle it a certain way, a one room schoolhouse of different level, like a really nice lab setting, of the in-person lab setting where it's really constructive, like that's really amazing thing to offer people. And obviously, just because you can offer that, like I've been in labs that were very supportive, labs that were totally disinterested. It doesn't mean it's going to be great, but like chasing something of substance that's sort of you have different layers of people that can actually interrelate and talk, like that's awesome, especially when there's intentionally being constructive about it and so on. But to come back to it, sort of like, yes, these sort of one room schoolhouse ideas, and then the reality of like your 100 level, 300 people in the classroom, and just like uh, uh, just tremendous pressure. Like we've said time before, and one of our intern project was looking specifically at K through 12 stuff, and just does your teacher become an IT manager, and that's really hard, So where the technical and the implementation realities at hand, and that's why I think it's a really difficult time. It's an optimistic time because people are necessities, the mother, father of innovation, or whatever the saying is. But for
Invention.
people that
Yeah.
aren't empowered enough to realize there are alternatives of health ones that they can get, or realize they have access to, or frankly have access to begin with, it's exciting. And for people that don't have that, it's really the apathy and the disempowerment of it. It's sort of the latest version of the digital divide. Is kind of around that. Like, do you have the means to pursue something, or a community that can do it? So, and like also to take off whatever hat, put on a different one, and be support talk up to big up orthogonal lab for a moment. Like, it is an incredibly challenging thing for people that for people who don't know or haven't tried to do something like that. Maintaining a sort of alternate academic space over time, over technology differences, over ups and downs, over changes in technology, over bad things happening, over various personal life situations evolving and opportunities. That's an incredibly challenging thing to have happen. So kudos to Bradley again for like maintaining this for a long time and letting me, experiment with my stuff and do my things, but also like realizing that this is something that you can do for people. Like, you can make the space and enable them to do, whether it's open source community and open source technology or free software or whatever you want to do with that. But just like realizing there's something that you can do to that end as well. And it will look and feel, it's a different game you're playing. So I will leave it at that. And yeah.
All right. Great. Yeah, and you've been like in the Slack, you've been discussing some new things with this rollout of your infrastructure for JoePro. So you, of course, have this Just Future YouTube channel, which is that's good. So you're going to archive your old account, and you're going to have the JoePro account.
It will eventually be my old one was like just -parent or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go back to that, but for there's like you can subscribe to the new one where I will actually post content, and like you'll still be changed when the name comes over. It's just like this. I'm trying to upgrade a lot of the web stuff. I'm doing the website. I'm doing the YouTube. It's going to be like specifically academic content. I'm doing the JoePro thing, which has stuff going on here. It's just this, as we're talking about, you have to periodically update these little layers of distribution, and it's typically not very fun, and you can get help for it if you want, but it's just like, a lot of it's very customized anyway. So
yeah.
It's quite tedious, but you have to do it. And it's why professors don't change their websites and their face for like their picture for like 20 years, and they look like a different person. So yes, but thank you for mentioning that. And as I said there, like if anyone in the lab has if you want to be mentioned, if you like, I'm sure I'm not going to speak for Bradley, but like if you want to be like mentioned in the channel, or like I think you can do like collaborator things where you add people to channels now, or you want to be mentioned if we post something on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. I'm using LinkedIn quite a bit, and I think outside of the I'm thrilled to announce kind of stuff. Like, I think LinkedIn is excellent for finding people that want to do certain things. So anybody who ever wants to talk about LinkedIn strategy or making a page, please reach out. I'm dealing with a lot of people and stuff. But if you have a handle, please do put it in Slack so we can mention it if you'd like to be mentioned in a professional capacity. If you don't want to do it, you're not sure. You're not sure if you have an account that maybe you don't want, people to see, that's fine too. We're aware of that.
What else? Oh, you have. That was just about the YouTube channels. So yeah, I mean that's a good outlet. So yeah, I'd like to do some collaborator kind of things where you kind of cross between the two channels. We'll have to set that up. I don't really know how that works, but
yeah, it's that could be a whole. Maybe there's something that we can. We might have a specific lab admin meeting about some stuff if you want to get into that, because there's other things that but yes, things are happening there, and it's periodic update, all that kind of stuff. I could say a whole lot more about that, but I'm sure there's other things we want to talk about in our limited time for today.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was good. Morgan, how are you? Looks like you're in your spot.
Yeah, hi. Excuse.
You're having trouble with your audio. It's cutting in and out.
Excuse me. I see. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, I think it's okay now. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah,
It was on
yeah.
Morgan's side.
Yeah.
It's better now.
Yeah, it was my, okay, 1 second. It's, I see Apple is trying to smartly grab my phone's microphone.
Yeah.
Oh, I hate that.
Yeah.
I
What?
loathe that so much.
It's
And
like,
especially like it will update that and like a conference. Like I was at the MIT Media Lab last year for the OG Lab thing, and it kept doing that as I'm like trying to show stuff or record, and I was like,
yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is come up in you know, anyway. Yeah, just wanted to quickly go through a couple things. So I don't know if I put this in the put this in the chat, but let me just bring up the, oops, no. God,
Oh, yeah.
it's like, I don't know what's worse, here. Okay. My Lord. Sorry, it's asking me to give it all sorts of
Yeah, you have to give permission.
recording.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, it's asking for screen and system audio recording permission.
Oh,
It's like, oh, okay, maybe because you've got it on.
no, it's just, I think it's just because it's Jitsi, maybe.
yeah, or like
It's saying, do you want to quit and reopen? It's like no, I didn't even ask for this thing. Okay, let's see if it'll let me allow. Okay, I don't know.
There we
why
go.
It
You
needs
got
to
it.
see my entire screen.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is just wanted to show terminal bench science that was announced. This is a really common, or it's been a good benchmark in the kind of just agentic worlds. So it was interesting to see that they've pulled together a bunch of people, including people like Russ Poldrack and Stefan Bowman, Neurodesk guy as well, are all on this announcement. So it's something, I only saw this week, and I haven't had time to really look at it yet, but it should be, it's got a bunch of good people already involved, and yeah, and looks like there's ways to also get involved with it. Got way too many things that happen Monday at 9 a.m. But so there's that, and then just wanted to go over quickly the again, the MEDArc is the this is the open science initiative that was originally part of Stability AI, and is now now kind of supported by Softened, which is the neuroimaging group from Stability, have their own company, and it's interesting. So, again, there's this Open Science Research Collective. You can get involved. Let's see if this actually goes to. Yeah, you can see the different. Yeah, there we go. So, I was originally kind of focused on the real-time mind eye part of this, but as you can see, they've got a number of other projects, and the fMRI Foundation model was certainly kind of where they started with the mind eye papers. The most recent is now a flat map, what they call a Cortex MAE, so a masked autoencoder. But what we're actually looking at right now is this structural MRI foundation model that is using a super large 300,000 volume data set. So it's referred to as FOMO 300K, which I think is pretty funny. And, I gotta say, what I find interesting about it is is what I'm able to. How can I turn this off? Okay, there we go. It's interesting following this, being able to sit in on a group that is thinking about how to. The FOMO 300K, I should say, is released as a part of FOMO 26, which is a challenge for MICI, which is a big medical imaging and AI conference. Very old conference. Like my co-advisor used to go to this, many, would be like 20 years ago now. So this was originally, a big kind of pattern recognition meeting, computer vision meeting, and now, of course, is much more deep learning, etc. But again, being a part of it is just interesting to see how people who I would call ML engineers are tackling a challenge that is the kind of thing that, like, again, 20 years ago would be solely a project of interest to a small group of medical imaging people, right? And I know that this does have something to do with, like Hinton's famous or infamous prediction that, I think like by 20, I might be making it more bigger than it was, but it was like by 2020 there won't be any radiologists anymore or something like that, right? like I forget exactly what his claim was, but
Yeah.
but it does get at this area where people like Hinton thought they could see like where these models would be superhuman, right? That finding these subtle distinctions is something that the human eye was not designed for, right? And so anyway, so it's interesting to follow this group to kind of be able to follow their meetings and their reasoning about this to see their one how self-supervised models have kind of taken over, and this is all about how much of this is about is really just about masking creative ways of masking and asking the models to fill in, right? and just a lot of those kinds of subtleties together with subtleties about how best to utilize the GPUs. And by that, I mean, like a lot of performance tuning to make sure that GPU utilization is as close to 100% as possible. And that like at no point, that you get past data loading bottlenecks and any CPU bottlenecks. And, like those, and what you're seeing with this group is like this, they're looking across like 6 to 8 tasks, right? So it's medical reasoning, pathology, fMRI, structural, they're looking at lots of tasks, but they're trying to find, what are the common things and be the best at those particular skills, because they've got a funding narrative that they're also trying to succeed at in terms of that these are the ML skills that you want to have to be able to be, if you will, a frontier science, a frontier science data modeling group.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. Another big announcement, or I think if the world was different, this would be a big announcement. It kind of gets lost in all the noise. But that Stanford merged its data science group with its AI group, or the two centers have merged, and that the the human-centered AI group is going to be the name moving forward. And I forget who's the wavelet guy, Candace, like Candes. I forget.
I think so,
The data science director is going to become a co-director of the human-centered AI center, and Fei Li will be, I forget what they're calling her. It's like special advisor to AI, like university. She's going to some university-wide position.
right.
Yeah. Anyway, it's
senior advisor on AI to the president.
Oh,
right. Yeah.
Which we definitely need more of.
Which, I mean, I gotta say, it sounded like one of those made up Trump positions.
yeah.
that he gives people, so that he doesn't have to get them confirmed.
Yeah.
Special employee.
I don't know what to read into that, but anyway, they were obviously trying to make it sound like, Stanford is now, is all in on AI,
Right.
But yeah,
I can't wait until I wonder how much what people are going to say in 10 years about about the way we have. Everybody has to talk about AI in a specific way right now, and if you don't, you're not getting. You're either a radical critic or you're just not getting funded. It's like,
Yeah,
or both.
you're not getting funded, right? Because it's like, it's really funny. It's really funny to me that, like, let's not forget that, like, Gary Marcus has an AI startup.
Yeah.
He's riding the gravy train too. Like, you can be a critic and be getting funded.
Right.
So,
he does it right, though. He doesn't just,
yeah. I mean, you're just leaving money on the table if you're not running, and again, these are, sorry, just a quick tower thing, right? CoffeeZilla, and some other people like to point this out all the time, right? Like there's so many quote AI companies that are really just former crypto companies, right?
Yeah.
And when I say that, like, some of those companies are the ones that we're using to do the MEDArc processing. So Nebius, for instance, right? And now, leaving aside their kind of their crypto origins and whatever you think of that, these are companies that just saw where the money, where the money is, and again, they already had a big play in GPUs, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So it was pretty natural, but again, this is also really common in the biotech companies that we see come through. Where 6 months later we'll see a company pitching about biology, and then 6 months later it's like, well, we're doing AI and biology now.
There have been times elsewhere in the evolution of various scientific fields and norms where how we're talking about AI now was at least somewhat adjacent to how you had to use different language before to get respectability. Like that's one of the harder things I think to think about too, is like to look back and think, oh, why was everybody talking about, like, cybernetics was once the really cool term to use, or a governor, or certain like behaviorism, or like these very specific things that were like, oh yeah, that's the thing. And it's just, we're in a moment where you are leaving, even in the simplest terms, you are leaving money on the table if you're not doing certain things. And so that's why there's, I think Varela was like talking about like it's the sociology of science, and meaning like thematic stuff, economic stuff, and other things that were also impacting how we talked about stuff too. So anyway, yes, and I very much appreciate the context.
You mentioned cybernetics, and it got me thinking about the apparently there's a Flatiron meeting.
Oh yes, you mentioned that. You posted that somewhere.
Yeah. So and that they were connecting that with control theory. And I wanted to try and find, like, unfortunately in that particular post, they just mentioned it and they didn't give me any links. But I'd like to track that down. So just to wrap up, continuing to develop various curricula, as well as needed tools for kind of control theory as it relates to biological data. and yeah, would love to see more um, more overlap, especially with groups like the Flatiron Institute, where they're purposely trying to use multiple domains to find common kind of computational um, uh, tools and frontiers. Yeah.
Can you offer a little bit of background on Flatiron? Because I think I'm associating with another group that I might be erroneously. What are they? Who are they? What are they doing? So they're bringing together these different.
Yeah, I want to just check my history on this, but I believe it's a Simons Foundation funded center that covers, the Simons Foundation has always had kind of like one foot in astrophysics, one foot in kind of frontier mathematics, one foot in frontier neuroscience, and maybe biology. There's definitely there's another computational domain, and I mean that's just literally the center in New York, right? Like there's other Simons Foundation funded groups, right? So like Berkeley's famous for for its theory of computing or something like that. And I think he was a student at Berkeley. But yeah, that's my off the top of my head what the Flatiron is. Yeah. And I think it's got a big cluster, and and again, I think the idea was that that they're sharing this building, and kind of like again, these are frontier areas, and so you know you'll learn from the applications of physics will bring up the computational tools that you need for neuroscience or something like that. But I could be wrong.
All right. Yeah, all right. That's great. So yeah, I think we can probably move on to a paper. I think we have about 30 minutes left, or 25 minutes left. But that was a great conversation. I think we kind of hit a lot of topics that I'd like to follow up on. A lot of open source topics, a lot of education topics, a lot of this, sort of, I mean, we think of AI as a new world, but it's really just some sort of innovation or some sort of disruption to the way of doing things. And it's interesting how people kind of deal with that in different ways. The administration oftentimes can be very immobile, or at least the bureaucracy of a university, but in some cases it seems like they can respond to incentives. So it's interesting. Okay. So this is a paper that I want to talk about. And this is called Thinking Beyond Tokens. This was an arXiv paper from 2025. And again, this is one of these things where people are considering sort of if it's very similar to that dragon hatchlings work, in that they're thinking about brain-inspired models, and then thinking about how to move from that to like higher level cognitive functions like reasoning. So they're kind of getting at the sort of dragon hatchlings idea from a different angle. And again, this is this reasoning step in models. Of course, they call it artificial general intelligence, but you could just as well say it's a large language model. In fact, I think they talk about large language models in the abstract. So this is thinking beyond tokens, from brain-inspired intelligence to cognitive foundations for artificial general intelligence and its societal impact. It's a very long title. I'm not familiar with the authors on this, but there are a lot of authors. And so the abstract reads, can machines truly think, reason, and act in domains like humans? This enduring question continues to shape the pursuit of AGI, or artificial general intelligence. It says this has, of course, been a question ever since before artificial intelligence, when people would build automata that would like play chess or something like that, and it would be a very, people would think it was a human, but it really wasn't. So it was kind of like, classic problems in cognitive science, like the Chinese room or something like that, where something would generate a response. And you'd have to wonder if it was being generated by an intelligence, or if it was being generated, say, by a pair of dice or some other machine. And so this is not new. This is something we've thought about for many years, for a long time. It's very deep in the roots of cognitive science. Despite the growing capabilities of models such as GPT 4.5, DeepSeek, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, V4, and Grok 3, which exhibit multimodal fluency and partial reasoning, these systems remain fundamentally limited by their reliance on token-level prediction and lack of grounded agency. So, you're kind of the next token up mentality of these models, or at least their limited capabilities of just thinking token by token, as opposed to thinking about frameworks and reason, especially higher order things like reasoning. And then, of course, this idea of grounded agency, which, whatever that means. We know what agency means, we know what grounding is, but like grounded agency is, I guess, maybe a kind of a way to deal with agents doing things in a context. This paper offers a cross-disciplinary synthesis of AGI development, spanning artificial intelligence, cognitive neuroscience, psychology, generative models, and agent-based systems. So there's a lot of things in this paper. We analyze the architectural and cognitive foundations of general intelligence, highlighting the role of modular reasoning, persistent memory, and multi-agent coordination. In particular, we emphasize the rise of agentic RAG frameworks that combine retrieval, planning, and dynamic tool use to enable more adaptive behavior. So we know what RAGs are in the group. These are these trainable models, or customizable training models. So we have that component, and that might actually be something that sort of operates within a large language model that provides these higher level capabilities. We discuss generalization strategies, including information compression, test time adaptation, and training-free methods, as critical pathways towards flexible domain-agnostic intelligence. So again, this is where we're looking for a type of intelligence that's transferable and not just limited to a certain context or a certain task. Vision language models, or VLMs, are re-examined not just as perception modules, but as evolving interfaces for embodied understanding and collaborative task completion. We also argue that true intelligence arises not from scale alone, but from the integration of memory and reasoning, an orchestration of modular, interactive, and self-improving components where compression enables adaptive behavior. Drawing on advances in neurosymbolic systems, reinforcement learning, and cognitive scaffolding, we explore how recent architectures begin to bridge the gap between statistical learning and goal-directed cognition. So this is where, we're kind of moving away from sort of the traditional models, the statistical models, and we're moving towards these sort of neurosymbolic models and sort of the more cognitive aspects of AGI. And of course, this is something we kind of miss when people talk about super intelligence, or when we talk about anything approaching sentience in models, is that we don't really, people who talk about that don't really think about the cognition of the agent. So, I mean, I think this is kind of a nice reminder for that. I mean, I'm just thinking about the audience for this, and, it may be obvious to our group, but maybe not to everyone. Finally, we identify key scientific, technical, and ethical challenges on the path to AGI, advocating for systems that are not only intelligent, but also transparent, value-aligned, and socially grounded. We anticipate that this paper will serve as a foundational reference for researchers building the next generation of general-purpose human-level machine intelligence. So that's a very aspirational abstract. A lot of things packed in there. So they're using this idea of AGI. They're focusing on these agentive RAG frameworks. They're also focusing on vision language models. All right. So this has a table of contents. So they kind of go through the historical evolution of AI, AGI, as well as agentic AI. Then, they have this section on understanding intelligence, the logical foundations. So they think about the brain, but they also think about cognitive processes. So in terms of brain functionality, they're thinking about brain functional states, memory, human action systems, world models as sort of these cognitive foundations, and then neural networks. So their definition of world models is basically the cognitive foundations of higher order behavior, I guess. So that's the brain functionality. And cognitive processes talk about networks and connectomes, and so that kind of they talk about that. Here is the way to bridge biological and artificial systems. Then they talk about models of machine intelligence, learning paradigms such as representation learning and knowledge transfer and knowledge distillation. Also talking about biologically inspired architectures, which we know well. Also symbolic, connectionist, and hybrid systems, and of course the neurosymbolic program, and then explainable AI, which is all part of these different models of machine intelligence. They talk about deep learning and reinforcement learning, and then AGI capabilities. So you have your core cognitive functions, which are reasoning, learning, thinking, memory, and perception. You also have your human-centered foundations, your societal integration, and then they get into the thing about vision language models and agentive AI in the context of large language models. And so then they propose that the vision language models and agentic AI are pillars for the future of AGI frameworks. So they really focus on those two things. So then they just kind of finish up and talk with benchmarks, and they talk about future work. So this paper, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I think it has a lot of interesting material in it, kind of laying out some points to revisit, kind of maybe weaving together a lot of the buzzwords that are very common now into this cognitive framework. So they talk about post-training strategies as sort of we talked about model reasoning earlier in the meeting. This is something that takes us beyond the next token approach to model output. So you have your next token predictions, and you use post-training strategies to introduce reasoning. So of course you can use things like RLHF or other types of approaches, but they also are limited to this sort of same autoregressive framework that the next token approach is. So, we have to keep that in mind. So, just the state of the art right now. We're still limited by our abilities to generate things that are what we might call open-ended and compositional. So we're looking for things that are open-ended and compositional, meaning that on the one hand, we want things to evolve outside of sort of a framework. So if we're constantly using autoregression to improve our model, we're not really looking at the larger picture of the world. So like your model interacts with training data, things are consistent with that training data. It's always going to be in that world. And then an open-ended model might be where it considers a larger context or other possible trajectories. And then, of course, compositional is where your answer is put together in a way that combines different reasoning steps or different maybe cognitive functions, as they'll get to later. So then, they point out that further scaling will not lead to AGI. You can't just scale these tools up. You need to have these fundamental shifts in how we approach this. So that's no news to us, of course. We've talked about neurosymbolic models. We've talked about world models and all of that. So these are things that are fundamentally different from sort of the state of the art that we have now. I mean, people are working on world models, but we're in very early days of that. They have this quote in here. Rodney Brooks in 2008 argued that intelligence emerges from physical embodiment rather than abstraction alone. And so again, if we just use things like chain of thought, tree of thoughts, or other types of trajectory modeling, we're limiting ourselves to this abstraction, and we're not taking into account physical embodiment. Okay, so this is, and then going through sort of the historical evolution of AI and the overview of HGI, and kind of the things that we have to keep in mind moving towards what they want to move towards in this paper. This is an interesting figure, a timeline of key milestones towards artificial general intelligence from 1950 to 2025. So their history of things here. Let's take a look at that because I think it might be quite interesting. So in the 1950s to the 1970s, you had these early foundations, which they define as the Turing test, which we talked about, the Dartmouth workshop, which was a place where they sort of did the formative work, and that was all kind of leading up to the perceptron and ELIZA, and then later on this idea of backpropagation. So there were a lot of things that kind of were formative to the kinds of things we do now. In 1972, we had the first rule-based expert systems. This was Mycin. And then, of course, those rule-based systems were very common throughout the 70s and 80s, and then eventually kind of fell into disfavor. Actually, they were used up until, I think, the 2000s, but, for different applications. So they stuck around for a while, but of course, they were found to be limiting for reasons that we've talked about in terms of like sort of the rise of statistical learning. Then, of course, in 1985, we get Bayesian networks. In 1988, we get convolutional neural networks. In 1997, we get IBM's Deep Blue, where this was the point at which Deep Blue was able to beat Garry Kasparov. Kasparov immediately turned around and started to figure out ways to sort of use computers to his advantage. So, we start to get hybrid chess, which of course is, or what they call chimeric chess, where you have humans and machines working together to sort of play chess in an optimal way, drawing on the strengths of each. Then in 2006, you get deep belief networks. In 2012, you get AlexNet. And then like this next 15 years is like the majority of this timeline, which is, it's there's been a lot of stuff in the last 15 years, but I think it gives a short shrift to this earlier period and sort of the historical roots of some of these methods. But this is a good timeline, I think, especially for the latter period here, where you have all these models that are kind of plugging in to this space. And then instead of just being this cacophony of models, we actually can look at sort of how one model enabled the next model. It would have been nice if they would have classified this timeline into different types of models, and how they kind of evolve according to separate trajectories, so like the large language models versus some of the other models. But yeah, this is nice. They have the Nobel Prize in 2023 in physics and chemistry that was awarded for AlphaFold. So that's where we are. And then of course AGI is a question mark, which of course is that could be way out on the right hand side here. So there are a lot of nice figures in this paper. They kind of a lot of conceptual figures. This one here, this figure section A, is where you have types of intelligence with brain center, whatever that means. Basically, it's like different types of intelligence. So you have technological, interpersonal, visual, logical, kinesthetic, naturalist, musical. So basically all these different forms of intelligence. If you go to the literature on multiple intelligences, I know Howard Gardner wrote a book a long time ago about multiple intelligences, or it was called Multiple Intelligences, where they kind of draw out these distinctions between the different types of intelligence. So it's just basically different types of expertise, but also different types of sort of aptitudes. So some people are very good at visual learning. Some people are very good at technology and so forth. And sometimes that's developed through expertise, but sometimes people have sort of an innate aptitude for things. So, and we still don't really understand how that works, but we do have to think about this for general intelligence purposes, that there are many intelligences. And if you're dealing with a general intelligence, you build one that has all of these attributes, or maybe one or two of these attributes. And then you have a bunch of agents with different types of attributes. And then that's your general or your super intelligence. I don't know. It's interesting. Then you have this figure here, which is a survey of, I guess, practitioners. How far are we from AGI? And there are a variety of answers, the largest category of which is that we are 20 plus years out from AGI. It's 37% of respondents. 3.6% of respondents say that we're 1 to 2 years from AGI. And then the rest of the people, I think, believe that we're from 5 to 20 years out from AGI. So I always find this category fascinating, because who are this 3.6% of people? These are like the true believers, but also people who aren't very good at like extrapolation. So you have these learning paradigms in AGI. So when we talk about AGI, it's different from thinking about AI in terms of as an intelligence, because you have a general aspect to it. So you need to have a lot of components to a general intelligence. So we have 8 things that they propose here. So you have these 8 learning paradigms, the first of which is continual learning, where you need to learn sequential tasks, where you need to have knowledge preservation over real-time cognition. The next is supervised learning, where you have labeled data sets and known outputs. You also have supervised learning or self-supervised learning, which is feature extraction and robustness. Their self got cut off here. Then you have contrastive learning, which involves similarity metrics and dissimilarity metrics. You have meta-learning, which has prior experience and rapid adaptation. You have semi-supervised learning, which includes efficiency improvements and accuracy enhancement. Unsupervised learning, which involves pattern detection and structure discovery. And then finally, reinforcement learning, which involves environmental interactions and reward optimization. So we have all these different forms of learning, and they all kind of have to fit together seamlessly. And as we know, if we combine like modern reinforcement learning with contrastive learning or reinforcement learning with continual learning, those are very hard to sort of integrate into a single model. So what we're looking at is trying to build a model with all these different types of learning that kind of work seamlessly together, which is kind of hard. In any case, we have a lot of different things in this paper. Some of this is just kind of like an overview of current work and trying to illustrate all of the state of the art, which I think is commendable, but of course, I don't know if it gets us any closer to AGI. I just wanted to point out this other paper, though. I'm not going to go through it in depth, but this is from Topics in Cognitive Science. And of course, this is a journal where they introduce current topics in the field, current different types of trendy things. And so they invite people to give presentation or to write papers on that. So this is Dynamical Cognitive Science, Wherefore Art Thou? And this is by Luis Favela and Vicente Raja. And of course, we know these people from our Cognition Futures sessions, where we talked a lot about embodied cognitive science, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science, especially 4E cognition. And so these two authors wrote this paper in Trends, and they are basically revisiting dynamical cognitive science and the dynamical hypothesis and thinking about sort of the evolution of that approach and where we stand with it. So it's kind of like the other paper where we had a discussion on the roots of AGI and how we kind of go forward. And this paper, so this topic revisits and elucidates the impact of dynamical systems theory since the dynamical hypothesis was presented in the 1990s as an alternative to the information processing approaches central to orthodox cognitive science, which means the kind of cognitive science that doesn't sort of include the dynamical perspective. So, it's usually like trial by trial experiments where we try to get mean behaviors instead of looking at trajectories and sort of dynamical unfolding behaviors. The dynamical hypothesis does not investigate cognition as necessitating explanations in computational or representational terms. So in the 1990s, people were developing dynamical cognitive science in response to sort of the cognitive revolution. You had, of course, ecological psychology and Gibson's approaches. We had the approaches of Michael Turvey and J.S. Kelso, who sort of proposed sort of an initial kind of dynamical hypothesis that behavior actually is dynamical, and you can't understand behavior unless you present it in a dynamical fashion. So this is, we're not really worried about computational representational explanations here. We're just interested in how behavior unfolds. This has interesting implications for AGI because AGI assumes that there are, many different types of learning, but doesn't necessarily assume that behavior can unfold in sort of a generative way, which is interesting because that's kind of the point, say, of a lot of large language models, that they are autoregressive, meaning that they have this trajectory that they constantly are trying to be consistent with, and they have this generative aspect where they're generating answers, maybe probabilistically. In dynamical cognitive science, it's usually based on previous context or the environment, but I think it's probably more consistent than we would like to think. Anyways, instead, dynamical systems theory is leveraged to approach cognition in temporal terms. So dynamical systems theory is all about the temporal flow of behavior, about the continuity of behaviors, how behaviors enable other behaviors, and how that can self-organize into larger structures and more complex behaviors. And so this is often a way to encompass brain-body environment systems, meaning that we have the brain and we have intelligence, but intelligence is often conditioned on the body and environment. So everything is inherently embodied, everything is inherently embedded in its ecological context or its environment. The contributions collected here examine DST's experimental, methodological, and theoretical roles across such areas as informatics, linguistics, and neuroscience, as well as philosophy and psychology. They explore how DST reshapes debates about computation, representation, and embodiment, extending from individual cognition to artificial and social systems. Papers address advances in fractality, multi-scale modeling, and nonlinear methods. Fractality being using fractals and fractal methods to explore time series. Multi-scale modeling being different time scales, different spatial scales, and then nonlinear methods being things that allow us to analyze dynamical trajectories. Then we're also interested in applications to behavioral and neural coordination and theoretical syntheses linking dynamics with cultural and symbolic processes. Together, they assess DST's growing influence in a dynamical renaissance within the cognitive and brain sciences, highlighting both its promise in its unifying framework and its conceptual challenges. So they're arguing that there's a renaissance of this kind of approach, where there was this initial burst of work in the 90s and 2000s, and now people are kind of bringing this to brain science as well as to embodied cognitive science and 4E cognition. So there have been a lot of advances more recently. So additionally, the corpus on dynamic work in the behavioral sciences keeps advancing both in the individual and social realms. This is clear when reviewing advances regarding the application of DST to understanding dynamics of categorization, development of listening to language, second language acquisition, or collective behavior. The conjunction of all these factors emphasizes the timelines of this topic, which means that this is the right time to reevaluate and reassess the importance of DST for the cognitive sciences. So again, really, when we talk about dynamics, we think about dynamical systems in their most basic and general sense, which is as a system that changes some of its properties in time. And so if we think about it this way, everything that has to do with cognition can be understood as a dynamical system. And so this is indeed the intuition motivating the dynamical hypothesis, which was first proposed by Van Gelder in 1995, which is itself a set of more concrete claims. So cognitive systems are dynamical systems by default, and the best tools to study them come from the dynamical systems hypothesis. So that's their position. And I think that's, I think a really good sort of stake in the ground, not only for cognitive science, but also for the study of AGI or the sort of people who propose AGI. If we can understand things like large language model outputs or other types of AI model outputs as dynamical systems, then maybe we can get a better handle on how they behave like cognition, or how they might compare to cognition. So and we've talked a lot about dynamical systems theory in cognition futures, and we've kind of framed this. We know kind of the sort of the history of it and the way people have framed dynamical systems and cognition from that. So I won't get too much into that, but I think it's food for thought. And it's nice to see that they're kind of putting down the gauntlet once again on that.
Yeah, I was in and out for some of that, but I remember Raja, and I happened to get a message from Amanda at this time when I mentioned that paper. She's like, oh yeah, Raha writes interesting stuff. So we might try to, Amanda and I might try to meet next week. We're trying to sort out all this crazy stuff. So we might meet actually Monday, which is around the DevoWorm time, just because that's the easiest time to do it at that time.
Yeah.
I don't think that's it's not a great time for me long term, and also DevoWorm proper. But we might talk about that paper and our EGRT paper Monday.
Okay.
So I might try to like record it or something, even internally record it, just to kind of slowly churn up the condition futures discussion group type stuff again.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Like, I appreciate you mentioning this paper in light of that, and it's cool stuff, and it's sort of it's interesting to see because I was looking at the old document, I think it was a Google document of the Cognition Futures Reading Group. We're up to like 81 episodes or 81 sessions last time. So
for what? The Cognition Futures or?
Yeah. The Cognition Futures, and then I don't even know if we merged that with the cybernetics one or not. But like just the old ways of keeping track of that. So
yeah.
We'll see where things can sort of bloom from this. But it's good to cover that paper and the other one too. I mentioned the other one to Avery also. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. All right, I think that's it for today. Thank you for attending, and see you next week.